Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Civil War Roundtable program. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Our goal is to create more informed, more engaged citizen leaders. We do this through programs like Good Citizen Day and other civics education programs for high school students, through publications, through exhibits like the one behind me, which actually just came down, and we're getting ready for our new exhibit on voting, through publications and lectures, and for carrying with one of the really great collections of Civil War history anywhere in the country, and through tonight's programs like tonight's Civil War Roundtable. So before I introduce our program, there's just one little housekeeping item. Our speaker tonight will be happy to take questions from the audience, and the questions can be asked through the function on Zoom in the middle of your screen, the Q&A. Just ask questions anytime during the program, and our speaker will be happy to get, again, to as many of them as he can. Now, tonight, unfortunately, our speaker, Harold Knudsen, is in Northern Virginia and has been hit by a major storm. He has no power, and therefore General Longstreet is not able to join us this evening. But have no fear, we have pivoted, as everyone is saying these days, and we have a great program that has been put together in the last few moments by the one, the only Professor Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation. And Jim is going to now regale us with what I think is going to be an interesting talk about William Penn, about another Philadelphian by the name of Butler, and about something about why it's all the Irishman's fault. And I'll let this Irishman take it from here. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you, instead of General Longstreet, the one and the only, our very own Mr. Jim Mundy. Jim.
Right. John, thank you very much. All right, folks, get ready. This is going to be a little bit of a roller coaster, perhaps. We'll see what happens. I haven't given this talk in a little while. It's also a little tongue-in-cheek. I hope that's okay. But if you know me, you know I have a sense of humor, I hope. And but the point I'm going to make is that, facetiously perhaps, is that I'm blaming the Civil War on a specific Irishman. So I call it William Penn meant well, as it relates to Philadelphia, but blame it on the Irish. So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint. So if you will bear with me, I'm going to hit share. And then I've got to hit from the beginning. All right, let's see if it works. Hot dogs, it does. Okay, so William Penn meant well, or blame it on the Irish. Let's see what happens, have fun. And so forgive me if mentally I skip a few beats every now and then, but I think we'll get the gist of it. It should be a lot of fun. All right, I hope you'll recognize this guy because he, in some ways, was the hero of the story in the sense that, as we know the story about Philadelphia, we know the story about Penn's conversion to Quakerism and therefore pacifism. We know that, he had very special dreams and visions for Philadelphia itself, as he did for the whole colony of Pennsylvania. But sometimes visions and dreams don't always come true, and in many ways because of events beyond our control. So, this Penn's ideal was a green country town which will never be burnt and always be wholesome. And that was after he didn't witness it, but he was in England at the time of the Great London Fire of 1666, which basically destroyed the center of London. And he didn't want that to happen to Philadelphia, so that was his goal. It would never be burned and always be wholesome. All right. And here we have Philadelphia, because in the 21st century, we think of Philadelphia as this big, amorphous plot of ground, if you will, between the Schuylkill and the Delaware rivers. But actually, Penn's original Philadelphia was only 2 square miles. And if you look at the center of this illustration, that grid pattern, that was the original city itself, from river to river, east to west, and then Vine Street on the north and South Street on the south. And so that was the city of Philadelphia. The rest of it was the county of Philadelphia. And this is important because as Philadelphia evolved in the 18th and especially the 19th century, the conflict between the city and the suburbs, so to speak, would become very, very important. in the way that Philadelphia reacted to the Civil War, to the South in general itself, to be quite honest. All right. So the city, especially after while the government was based here in 1790, roughly 1800. All right. The city would tend to be more federalist. All right. Hamiltonian. Okay. Whereas the county, the other 128 square miles of Philadelphia, would be the agrarian part, and that would be more Jeffersonian, and therefore more what they call the Democratic Republicans. All right, so the conflict that's going to evolve over the course of the city's history up to the Civil War is this conflict between city and country. All right, I hope that makes sense. And of course, as the 18th and 19th centuries evolved, especially the 19th century, Philadelphia is going to become the country's major industrial city. Now, and that would spread along the Delaware River. You can see that dark section there on the right-hand side along Delaware. That's the industrialized part of the city itself. So from the very beginning, Philadelphia was set up unknowingly and certainly unwittingly for this eventual political conflict. And then the military one that we know as the Civil War. All right, hope that makes sense. All right. Now, when Philadelphia began in the 19th century, it was known as the Athens of America. I mean, because it literally physically looked like something out of Greece. It had the most and the best amount of neoclassical Greek and Roman architecture. The building that you see here is, of course, the Girard College campus, Founders Hall in the center, designed by Thomas Shustak Walter, Philadelphia architect, who would later go on to design the dome and the center section for the Capitol building in the 1850s. That's his work also. So, I mean, Philadelphia was not just the Athens of America physically and visually, but also intellectually as well. And think of all those great organizations like the American Philosophical Society, the Franklin Institute, it would eventually become the Library Company. All right, all these intellectual organizations were as equally important as the architecture and the physical aspects of Philadelphia itself that made it the Athens of America. I mean, it was the center of culture, center of society. I mean, it was still an English city in a lot of ways. And that would be important because the plantation aristocracy in the South wanted to be more English than anything else because there really wasn't anything in the South at all. And so Philadelphia is literally the closest major city to the South itself. It was then and it still is today. So many Southerners were visiting Philadelphia and eventually moving to Philadelphia, and that plays into our story as well, so that they could partake in what was the epitome of Anglo-American culture. Hope that makes sense. All right, what else we got here? Oh, Latrobe's Bank of Pennsylvania, one of the great buildings of colonial Philadelphia. Unfortunately, it met the wrecker's ball it lasted until the 1880s, from the 1820s. So again, but now you get this idea of why Philadelphia was called the Athens of America. All right, and of course the Merchants Exchange at 2nd and Walnut, which is still there. William Strickland and that great lantern, which is a copy of the Greek lantern. Now I forget. There's my first senior moment for the night, but it still exists in Greece though. So again, and you can see off to the right, you can see Samuel Blodgett's first Bank of the United States, which is actually Roman and not Greek, but you get the idea though, right? Oh, and there it is, okay. As they say, designed by Samuel Blodgett, still there, owned by the National Park Service. So you can see how Philadelphia is evolving. And so here we go. Quote, Philadelphia is a city to be happy in. Delightful cleanliness everywhere meets the eye. Everything is well conditioned and cared for. And Nathaniel P. Will, so that's in 1831. All right. So Philadelphia is the center of America at this point in time. It's no longer the largest city in America. New York is now the largest city. But New York doesn't have any amount, or even close to the amount of sophistication that Philadelphia has. So that's what's going on there. Here's either the hero or the villain of the story, Pierce Butler. All right. Born in County Carlow, Ireland, he was the 5th son of an Anglo-Irish baronet. And when you're the 5th son in any kind of a family, basically, you're out of luck because you don't get much. I mean, the oldest son, primogeniture, would inherit everything. And then the sons after that basically had two options, the clergy or the military. And so Butler's father bought him a commission in the British Army. And he would join the 7th Dragoons, and he would end up in Boston in 1770, right, for the Battle of Boston. After that battle was over, they quickly got the soldiers out of there. Butler would go back to England, but then come back in time for the war itself. So this is Pierce Butler. All right. Here we go. This is his lasting claim to fame. All right. So let me go back a little bit about Butler then. All right. So Butler came back to the colonies because it's not America yet, with the British Army. He was in the South, in Virginia. He met Mary Middleton, who was the daughter of Henry, who was the daughter of William, who was the son of Thomas, and they were the country's largest plantation and slave owners, largest. And so Pierce Butler would fall in love with Mary Middleton. He would marry her. He would then sell his commission in the British Army. He would buy his own plantation called Butler Island. It still exists. It's in the islands off of the northeast coast of Georgia, is where Butler Island is, and Sea Island and places like that. And he would become a slave owner and a plantation owner himself. All right. He would jump ship now that he has no commission in the British Army. He would become an officer, eventually reaching the rank of major in the South Carolina militia. He would fight for the colonies during the American Revolutionary War. And because we're on the winning side of it, Butler is in good position to become a very wealthy and influential man. So after the war, he would become a senator from South Carolina. And in 1787, he became South Carolina's only representative to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And that's important because Butler's claim to fame is this. All right, Article 4, Section 2, the Fugitive Slave Clause. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Basically, folks, welcome to slavery. This is how we got slavery in the American Constitution. And Butler fought for its inclusion. And because of the political dynamics of the Constitutional Convention, especially where the Southerners, even then, were fairly dominant in all the different ways you can imagine, Butler got this inserted in the Constitution and he kept it there. So as they say, William Penn meant well, but blame it on the Irish, specifically this particular Irishman, Pierce Butler. Now, Butler, as again, Philadelphia is the center of the East Coast universe in the 18th century. And Butler had already been to Philadelphia many times. And he would eventually buy a house in Philadelphia in 1805 and would spend the rest of his life in Philadelphia. And he and his family are now buried at Christ Church, but next to the church itself, not the Christ Church burial ground. So Butler is still with us to this day. So what happens next? All right. So William Penn is long dead, died in 1718. Slavery exists in the country. And you can see where all these different red dots are. Those are households where slaves were owned in Philadelphia. And you can see the dates, 1789 and 1791. So slavery is now part of Philadelphia. It's politics, its economy, and its culture. So, all right. Now, here we have, what you can see is the very northeastern coast of Georgia, all right, around Darien. And you can see that little insert on the along the right-hand side. So you can see Butler Island, right? So that is where the Butler plantations were located up to the time of the Civil War, and actually after the Civil War itself. So just to put that in some geographical perspective, all right? And you can see North Savannah is to the north, all right? Okay. All right, this is Butler's house in Philadelphia called the Butler Mansion. It was at 8th and Chestnut Street. It's no longer there, obviously, because Chestnut Street doesn't exist the way it did back then. But you can obviously see he was a man of great wealth and influence. So now, that is the Butler family tomb. And as I say, it's right next to the church, the church itself at Christ Church. All right. So actually, let me go back before we go to there, because I just wanted to bring up one thing about Butler. Because this will play into the story later on. So Butler had a family with Mary. His one son, Louis, married a Catholic, and he was immediately disinherited and expelled from the family. She was French. His daughter, Margaret Mary, had 8 children by James Meese, who was from Philadelphia. And the oldest boys were named James and Thomas. And James Butler Meese and Thomas Butler Meese were going to inherit their grandfather's estates. But first they had to change their name. They had to make their surname Butler, which they both did in a heartbeat, as you can imagine. So hence there was another Pierce Butler in the story as we go along in the narrative, and that's where he came from. Now Thomas would also he would die before his brother did. Pierce wouldn't die until 1867, but he would be the center of a lot of controversy in Philadelphia leading up to the Civil War itself. So let's get going on that. All right. So here we have the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. So while we had slaves in Philadelphia, you also had the Slavery Society itself. So I would point out, okay, so in the back row, second from the left, Edward M. Davis, he would marry the daughter of Lucretia and James Mott, who are in the bottom row on the right-hand side, and he would live next to them on the Old York Road in Shelton Hills, because it was on their ground that Camp William Penn would be established in 1863 during the Civil War. And Camp William Penn was the first major training camp for Black soldiers in America, the United States Colored Troops raised in Philadelphia. All right, and then the last gentleman on the right would be J. Miller McKim, a strident and ardent abolitionist, and he would become a founding member of the League. Okay, so he would inject a lot of that abolitionism into the League itself. All right, after that, we can move on, but do note that Robert Purvis is sitting in the center on the bottom row, one of the city's most influential and prominent African-American citizens in the 19th century. All right, so here again, we have this conflict arising in Philadelphia between slaveholders and abolitionists. All right, so the society built Pennsylvania Hall. It was on North 6th Street, just above above Vine, or Race rather, I'm sorry, actually where today's studio for WHYY stands, actually. It's on the same site. It was opened less than a week. There was as you can imagine, a pro-abolitionist meeting with blacks and whites, men and women, and the Philadelphians just weren't going to put up with it, because at this point Philadelphia is getting a reputation as a fairly racist city in the country. So this was Philadelphia's response to to abolitionism, if you will. Just burn it down, and they did. All right, so Philadelphia is still a fairly violent city at the same time. And again, we're still talking about that 2 square miles, okay, all right? Because in 1844, there were anti-Catholic riots. Again, this is before the Irish famine. So the famine had nothing to do with this. It's just part of this movement towards American nativism in the 1840s and the 1850s in American politics. And so in Philadelphia, in 1844, there was a dispute about public education and Catholics attending public schools and which Bible they could read or should read. Now, of course, the Catholics had the Douay Bible, but the Protestant Bible, called the King James Bible, being used by the Episcopal Church, was the one that was being used in the schools. And so the Catholics wanted Catholic children to use the Catholic Bible, and the result was a riot in 1844. So it's also good to note that a future Union League member and president named Morton McMichael was the sheriff of Philadelphia at this time, and he literally rode to the rescue and squelched the riot. So, all right, now here we go. They were anything but a happy couple. In what has to be the greatest example of don't ask, don't tell, we have Pierce Butler on the left. So that is Pierce Butler's grandson. So this was Pierce Butler Meese. Right? Now he's Pierce Meese Butler. And he is, as we know, he inherited his grandfather's plantations and slaves. He's now one of the largest, not the largest, but one of the largest, probably one of the top 5 largest plantation slave owners And he's not a Southerner, he's a Philadelphian, because Butler was born and raised in Philadelphia, and he will die in Philadelphia, and he will be a Philadelphian. So, and of course, there's the wonderful irony in that, going back to William Penn. And on the right is Fanny Kemble. She was the daughter of John Kemble, who was the most, probably 19th century, the greatest Victorian Shakespearean actor in England. And she had come to America on tour with her father and their family. The whole family were actors and actresses. Pierce Butler saw her in Boston, fell in love with her right away, chased her all over the country, proposed to her a number of times, and she refused, and finally she gave in. But what didn't happen is that, Pierce never said to Fanny, you're marrying into the Butler family. This is where my money comes from. I'm a slaveholder. I believe in slavery. And Fanny Kemble, as you might have guessed by now, was an abolitionist. She was anti-slavery all the way. If only they had said something to each other. I mean, I can't imagine that they didn't, but who knows? But anyway, it was more like don't ask, don't tell, because they got married, and the next thing you know is they got problems. So let's see where we go next. All right. Let me go back then just to here then, right, just for what it's worth. All right, so in 1838, they were married. In 1839, they took a trip to family plantations in Georgia, to Butler Island. And Fanny was incredibly repulsed by what she saw. She came back to Philadelphia and basically disowned her husband and his slaves and his slavery. And at that point, the marriage was over. Now, they was probably the most phenomenal divorce case in the country. Eventually, they were divorced in 1849. So you can imagine what that was like. And at that point, they had two girls, one of whom would always be her father's daughter, and the other one would be her mother's daughter. So the family was split down the middle, just like everybody else. Okay, all right. Now, this is a house that was built by Pierce's brother, Thomas. It's at 13, you can see 13th and Walnut. And it was never lived in by the Butlers themselves. It was a school for girls. It was built in 1831, but it was for sale in 1850 when the Philadelphia Club bought it. And they have been there ever since, right? Pierce Butler briefly joined the Philadelphia Club, but his finances are always such that I don't think he lasted very long. So there is a Butler mansion still left in Philadelphia if you want to look at it that way. And I bring this up too because the Philadelphia Club, of course, is where the League basically came from, if you look at the founding members of the Union League. So let's see where the next slide takes us. All right, I'm going to go back up just one then. All right, I'll let it go where it is. All right, so so this gentleman comes in right after Major Butler is maybe the villain in the story. His father, Jared Ingersoll, was a lawyer in Philadelphia. So they are now an old Philadelphia family, one of the first families of Philadelphia, if you will. His father signed the Declaration of Independence, and so they are also an old family, but a wealthy family and a very respected family. But it will be a family that becomes typical of Philadelphia and the country in the sense that it was split. So Charles Jared, who was a lawyer in Philadelphia as well, for 10 years from 1841, well, not 10 years, but 1841 to 1849, he would serve as a congressman from Pennsylvania, or from Philadelphia. He was a Democrat, because at this point, our political parties are the Democrats, and they were created, if you will, in 1813, and they are still here today as the Democrats. And of course, the other party, which were the Hamiltonians, that is the Federalists, in 1834, they became the Whigs, as founded by Henry Clay, all right? And then in 1854, with slavery being the main issue in the country at that point in time, the Whigs pretty much dissolve and they become Republicans, all right? But in the 1840s still, we have Whigs and Republicans. And so Charles Jared Ingersoll served as a Democratic member of the House of Representatives. And his brother, Joseph Reed Ingersoll, served as a Whig representative. And Joseph Reed Ingersoll is a founding member of the League in the sense that he signed the League's Articles of Association. And as you can see, obviously, the brothers didn't agree. And it just goes to show you again how split Philadelphia was in its approach to slavery, its relationship with the South, and eventually the Civil War. All right, so Charles Godfrey Leland. The Lelands, again, were an old Philadelphia family. Philadelphia, if you've heard me talk once, you've heard me say it many times, but Philadelphia really was a southern city, right? I mean, up until this day, there is no larger city south of Philadelphia, okay? From, north, yes, you have New York in the northeast, Chicago in the northwest, Houston in the southwest. But in that whole southeast corner of the United States, to this day, there is not a larger city than Philadelphia. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, again, you heard me say earlier, Philadelphia would become the focus for Southerners because both socially, culturally, educationally, because Philadelphia in the 19th century is the center of both legal and medical education. All right, there was no certified medical school south of the Mason-Dixon line, so Southern mothers are sending their sons to become doctors in Philadelphia. All right, and actually during the Civil War itself, more than half of all the medical students in Philadelphia were from the South. All right, didn't keep them from coming. So Philadelphia, as I mentioned earlier, was becoming the country's major and largest industrial or manufacturing city. All right, and its manufacturing was a Southern-based connection because Philadelphia, at the time of the Civil War and in the 1850s, was the world's, not the country's, but the world's largest textile manufacturing center. Cotton, wool, everything else in between. All right. And a lot of that raw product came from the South and did many other products such as lumber, turpentine, things like that, tobacco, which is why Philadelphia was a center of cigar and cigarette manufacturing in the 19th century, right? All of this stuff is coming into Philadelphia as a raw product and then gets turned into a finished product that then gets sold and makes the Southern plantation owners wealthier. And so in Philadelphia, as you can see, according to Charles Godfrey Leland in his memoir of 1893, but at this point, he's talking about the 1850s and the 1860s. So on the other hand, if you look below that, you can see what William Wells Brown, who was an African-American abolitionist, and he was barely African-American. He was what they called an octoroon. He was 1/8 African-American. But that's all it took. You were not white, you were black. And so, as you can read, color phobia is more rampant here in Philadelphia than in the pro-slavery, Negro-hating city of New York. All right. Wow, like what happened to William Penn's dream? Where'd that vision go? All right, what is happening to the city of brotherly love? I mean, seriously, what is happening to Philadelphia? All right. All right, now here we go. In 1854, there was something called the Act of Consolidation. Philadelphia's population was in the upper 400,000s. It is the second largest city in the country, surpassed only by Manhattan, right? Because New York wasn't consolidated yet itself. And so this is what Philadelphia looked like after the Act of Consolidation. It was in February of 1854. And the largest, I mean, the most important reason for the consolidation was the fact that Philadelphia had a law and order issue. That is, and if you look at Philadelphia, you can see what it says, the city of Philadelphia itself, all right? So let's say that you're a bank robber, but you live north of the city. Let's say you're in the Spring Garden District. You can cross Vine Street, rob a bank, and skedaddle back across Vine Street, and the Philadelphia City Police cannot chase you. They cannot do anything to you. You could be a mugger. You can mug somebody, rob them personally, do the same things. As long as you skedaddle back across one of those borders, whether it was, Vine Street or South Street, you were safe. And then, of course, there were economic issues, political issues, and things like that as well. But law and order was a serious issue in the 1850s, and so the state passed the Act of Consolidation in 1854. And now the city and the county are one political unit altogether, but we still have those political issues between the city and the rest of the city, between the original city itself and what is now the rest of the city of Philadelphia, all right? So urban versus rural and agricultural, all right? So remember, the city itself is voting and had voted primarily Whig, all right? And then Republican after 1854 with one Democratic mayor in 1853, 58, I'm sorry, 56, Richards Vaux. And the county itself traditionally voted Democratic. So that's the conflict, right? Because that's the conflict that's going to happen, that's going to be with us at the time of the Civil War itself. All right, what's next? All right, the election of 1856 is fascinating, all right, at least from Philadelphia's perspective, right? So we know that there was a Democrat who ran, James Buchanan, from Pennsylvania, Lancaster County. We know there was a Republican. Again, as we mentioned earlier, the Republican Party was organized in 1854. This is their first American presidential election, and their candidate is going to be John C. Fremont, the great pathfinder, right? The Western explorer of California, right? And the third party is going to be something known as the American Nativist Party, or popularly known as the Know Nothings, right? Philadelphia was the center of American nativism, as I said earlier, in the 1840s and the 1850s. So how did, and as you can see now, this flag that you see was created for the 1856 election. It's called a campaign handkerchief. They were kind of like the bumper stickers of the day. All three parties had them, but obviously you would have had some for Buchanan, some for the Republican candidate, and then now, of course, for the American nativists. And the reason, and of course, to be a member of the American Nativist Party, you had to be white, male, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and native born. Otherwise, you didn't get in. Plain and simple. Okay. So how did Philadelphia vote in the presidential election of 1856? All right. Well, Buchanan got the most votes. And then, I'm sorry, the candidate for the American Nativist Party was Millard Fillmore, who was the former vice president as a Whig, governor of New York, wasn't even in the country when he was nominated at the American Nativist Convention, but ran anyway. So those are the three candidates. So Philadelphia voted, all right, 89% for the Democrats and the American Nativists. That is, the two parties who were avowedly pro-slavery, therefore anti-Black, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-everything. 89% of the city, that is, of those eligible to vote, we're talking white males, right? Keep that in mind. But 89%, Fremont only got 11% of the vote in Philadelphia. Now, nationally, the Republicans got 33% of the vote, but Philadelphia, 11% of the vote. So you can see that Philadelphia is not exactly an abolitionist and slave-friendly city. I mean, all right, it was not a good place to be if you were African-American. And keep in mind, at this point in time, Philadelphia also had the country's second largest free Black population, about 20,000 free Blacks were living in Philadelphia, and that was second only to Baltimore. So Philadelphia, so it's like, wow, what's going on in the city of brotherly love? All right, okay. Here we have the Great Weeping. We're going back to Pierce Butler. Pierce Butler, again, you know, it's hard for families to keep family businesses going if you want to think of a plantation as a family business. And Pierce Butler wasn't a very good businessman. Actually, he was pretty bad. He was also a bit of a reprobate. He wasn't close to being an alcoholic, if not quite. He was a gambler, and he was always short of money, to the point where I think it was in 1857 or 58, the three trustees were placed in charge of the Butler plantations and the Butler slaves, because it was clear that Pierce Butler couldn't do it anymore. And the only way to pay off Butler's gambling and drinking debts, which were approximately $700,000, was to sell slaves. And so on March 2nd and 3rd of 1859, a slave auction took place at the Ten Brook racetrack outside of Savannah, Georgia. And to this day, it's called the Great Weeping, because there were 436 slaves sold, many of them family units, that is, fathers, mothers, and children, but then separated at the auction itself. So and this was the largest slave auction in American history. And again, the irony, of course, is that the slaves weren't owned by a Southerner, right? They're owned by a Philadelphian. And we keep forgetting, and that's something that we keep forgetting about Philadelphia. It was a Southern city. All right, and here you can see, and this was one of the broadsides about the sale. All right, so Here we go, 1860. What's going to happen in Philadelphia? It's going to vote for Abraham Lincoln. What the heck happened? All right. That over the course of the 4 years during Buchanan's presidency, people saw exactly, a lot of people in Philadelphia saw what was happening in Washington, D.C., what was happening with the slavery issue. But I think that when this election campaign took place, Philadelphians realized that, Philadelphia was the birthplace of America. And it was about to become the place where America could be destroyed. And Philadelphians voted 52% for Abraham Lincoln. That is one heck of a big turnaround. All right. So Philadelphia is starting to redeem itself, or at least it's acting differently. It's acting more the way that it would have maybe if William Penn was still alive. All right. Philadelphia Club. Go back. All right. And I just want to peek at this slide and see what's there. That's what I thought. Good. All right. Well, anyway, let's do this. Right here. So here's the Philadelphia Club Board of Directors. From left to right: James Marque, Harry M. McCall, Lawrence, William B. Page, George H. Boker, Alexander Wilcox, and William Schott. All right. Now, if there's one name in that group and one person that stands out, you get 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. George Boker, one of the 2 founders of the Union League itself. So Boker's a fascinating character. He came from a family that were originally Huguenot in Philadelphia. Father became the manager of the Girard estate. When he died in 1831, his estate is worth $7.5 million, which would be over $1 billion in today's world. All right. So McMichael's father became the manager of that estate. So obviously he's going to be a wealthy man. George was educated at private schools in Philadelphia. He went to Princeton, which is where all Philadelphia sons went, not University of Pennsylvania, but Princeton. Okay. And we saw Charles Godfrey Leland earlier. He was Boker's classmate at Princeton. They were that close, if you will. So in 1856, George Boker voted for James Buchanan because, like old Philadelphia families voted Democratic. I mean, their livelihood was tied in with slavery because many old Philadelphia families owned plantations and slaves as well. All right. And if they didn't own the plantations and slaves, were certainly some of these manufacturing companies, if you will, that were receiving products from the South that were being then sold and making these families wealthy. And so that was important. And so in 1856, George Boker voted straight Democratic. All right. By 1860, George Boker has a political epiphany. I find out what happened. Unfortunately, there's nothing in his records yet that says what it was that struck him or hit him that made him become a convert to republicanism and abolitionism. But as we know, when you convert to something, you become even more emphatic about your issues than those who are already born into them, so to speak. So Boker is going to become one of the most, I wouldn't say rabid Republicans, but he's going to become one of the most visible and vocal Republicans in the city of Philadelphia. All right. Now, at this point, he is, as you can see, on the board of directors. He would stay on the board. He would remain a member of the Philadelphia Club. I think he joined the Philadelphia Club after he came back from Princeton, in the late 1840s. So Boker never left the Philadelphia Club as a member, but he would become one of the 2 founding members of the Union League of Philadelphia. And by the end of the war, 33% of Philadelphia Club members would join the Union League, which also means that 67% did not. And so they were, in theory, more on the side of the Democrats and the Old South than Republicans and the Union League, so to speak. Okay. All right. And this is what things were like in Philadelphia at the start of the war. Now, the war began on April the 12th of 1861 when the Confederate Army bombarded Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and that set it off. Okay. Now, the first quote is Boker: "At no period in the struggle was the patriotic spirit so low, or the spirit of the traitors so insultingly hopeful. Our secret foes had emerged from their seclusion, taking their wonted social places and boasting to their foreign visitors that, in what was called unmixed society, they ordered matters and that all gentlemen would soon be of their way of thinking." So Charles Jared Ingersoll literally believed that Philadelphians should just lay down their arms and capitulate to the South and let the South make their claims. And here you have Charles Ingersoll, club life reached a state of disruption. Other social assemblies are nothing more than a nice meeting of traitors led by the jackal, Charles Ingersoll. Okay. All right. Now, Charles Ingersoll was the son of Jared, and that is he on the right-hand side. On the left is Sidney George Fisher, who was probably then and now Philadelphia's greatest diarist. He would marry Elizabeth Ingersoll. So he marries into the Ingersoll family. So Charles and his brother Edward were the two most vocal pro-Confederate, pro-Southern, pro-slavery, pro-Confederate Army citizens in Philadelphia during this war itself. Fisher himself was a Republican, an abolitionist, but a very lukewarm one. And Fisher wasn't going to rock the boat a lot. But if you ever want to read anything about what it was like to be in Philadelphia during the Civil War itself, read Sidney Fisher's diary. It is the single best window into what was going on in Philadelphia, especially at the level of the upper class, which the Ingersolls and Fisher belonged. Okay. So Charles Ingersoll continues to be the bad guy. The Ingersolls are now the bad guys. All right. All right. So Abraham Lincoln wins the election, and his inauguration is in March. So he takes the train from Springfield, Illinois, north to Chicago, east into Michigan City. It'll go down to Cincinnati. Michigan City, Cincinnati, Cleveland, all right, Buffalo, across New York to Albany. I'm sorry, took a brief stop. They go to, to Albany, down to New York to Trenton, Trenton, Philadelphia, Philadelphia to Harrisburg, Harrisburg to Baltimore, Baltimore to Washington, right? So Abraham Lincoln was in Philadelphia on Washington's birthday in 1861. And Lincoln is standing on the platform. He is towards the left center. And he gave a wonderful speech that day. And I think I have a quote. Nope, I did not. But anyway, but actually what he did say is that there was no more important political or philosophical work than the Declaration of Independence, and that he would as soon be shot on that spot than give up his belief in those values that were in that declaration. And so it kind of makes you wonder if he didn't think something might happen, but who knows? All right, so we talked about Fort Sumter. That's the bombardment. All right. Okay, so what's happening in Philadelphia? Well, Philadelphia is going to be Philadelphia. It's going to be split right down the middle. So here we have it. The newspaper of April the 14th, just 2 days later, noted that a single block of Walnut Street, 22 Southern families occupied palatial residences. The 900 block of Spruce Street was known as Spruce Row because every family came from the Carolinas. I mean, there were blocks with families from Virginia, blocks with families from Georgia, in what we think of today as Society Hill. All right. But it is impossible to overestimate exactly how Southern Philadelphia was, all right? Philadelphia was so Southern that even before the war began, there was a newspaper. Oh, I've gone way too long, haven't I? Oh my gosh. I'm sorry, John.
No, finish. This is a great place to end, I think.
Okay, actually it would be. All right, because we know what happens with the war itself. All right, so in Philadelphia, there was a pro-Confederate newspaper called the Palmetto Flag, and it was being published in Philadelphia before the war even began. That's how pro-Confederate Philadelphia was becoming. And this is an example of it. So here we see the last issue that was published on Saturday, April the 13th, the day after the bombardment on Fort Sumter. Now, once the Civil War began, pro-Union Philadelphians stormed the office of the Palmetto Flag and basically trashed it. And it was the last time they published the Palmetto Flag. Let me just see where my last, okay, we know Santiam. George Boker on the left, John here on the right were the two founders of the league. You know what? I think that just might be it. So I'm sorry. The Article Association. What do you think, John? Just call it quits?
Well, no. So let's talk. If I can ask you a couple questions, which I think
sure.
There are a few questions that are kind of the same, in the same kind of pew of the church, if you will, Jim. And okay, so this southern-oriented city with slave owners, powerful slave owners like Pierce Butler and others, winds up being a Union town, right? So they vote for Lincoln. They vote for Lincoln again. How did that happen?
Again, the best consensus is that Philadelphians realized that, and again, and this, it seems awfully simplistic, but this was the birthplace of America, and the Civil War was going to destroy America if we elected a Democrat to office, both in 1860 and in 1864. I mean, it's again, it sounds simple, but I think that's really what happened. And so Philadelphia, at least voting Philadelphians, rallied around their country, and they rallied to Abraham Lincoln, and
they rallied, Jim, excuse me, and they rallied around the Union League.
I was about to say they rallied enough to create what was the greatest patriotic society in the country when it was organized on December 27th of 1862 as the Union League of Philadelphia. Plain and simple.
Now, Jim, there's a very specific question here, and it's a legal question about the status of fugitive slaves' children. I'm going to ask you this question, not sure if you know the answer. I can only hazard an educated guess, but the question is, how did the Fugitive Slaves Clause interact with Pennsylvania Emancipation Law? I'm not sure that's quite the same thing, but here's the question. Would a fugitive slave's children be free at birth under Pennsylvania law? Do you happen to know the answer to that question?
Well, I will say they were not freed because, I mean, think of the Dred Scott, think of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1859. So even because even during the war, freed slaves a freed slave living in Philadelphia could still be returned to his or her slave owner with their family during the war itself.
Sure.
They were not really free.
And this is, of course, a question from Wayne Strasborough, who always asks good questions. And I'm going to just hazard a guess that under Pennsylvania law, the answer would be yes. And under federal law, the answer would be no. And then we fought that out for the next 60 some years. And I'm sure there are other people who have a much better answer than that. But that's a really great question. And I'm sorry, Wayne, I don't have a better answer, but I'm going to try to get one because I'm curious myself, and I'll post that on our Q&A and comment section on YouTube tomorrow because I think that's a great question. Jim, we are out of time. You have done again a wonderful job filling in, and we will try to get Wayne and General Longstreet rescheduled for later in the year, perhaps.
Yeah, that would be great.
But Jim, thank you so much. You have pinch hit and you've hit a home run, and thank you, Jim. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. And I apologize for not getting through my talk. So but there's some other time.
Not at all, Jim.
All
thank
right.
you again.
Well, thank you everybody for watching.
To our audience, I hope you'll tune in for the Mondays with Monday. I hope you've been watching them. We post them in several locations, including our YouTube channel. You can just go search Union League Legacy Foundation. You'll see all the wonderful programs that Jim does on Union League history and related histories. And our next program, the Legacy Foundation's next online program, virtual program, is next Wednesday, the 29th of July, when we're going to have I think this is a really neat program on COVID and sports. We will have a program hosted by league member Harry Donahue. Some of you know him from Inside Golf or KYW or Temple Sports. He's going to be hosting the Phillies' own Tommy Green and Channel 29 or Fox 29. He's going to be hosting also Fran Dunphy, former coach at Temple and now AD at Temple University, and again, Union League member and doctor for the Flyers, Dr. Gary Dorsheimer. It's going to be a really interesting look at what to expect in the months ahead for professional and college sports. So that is next Wednesday evening. We will see you next Wednesday. Again, Jim, thank you for a great talk, and everyone have a wonderful, wonderful evening.